So welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today. It's really nice to see some friends, new and old, and some people I haven't met yet. So I'm going to start by saying a bit about what we're hoping to do here, and then Chloe and I will have a bit of a conversation about some of the ideas that we want to share with you, which will then open out to the group, and we'll talk a bit about the exercise that we asked you all to do in advance of the seminar, and just see where the conversation goes really. So I'm going to say a few things at the beginning. I've got a short set of slides that I want to share with you. So this webinar really started from a very concrete problem that we had in the Psychoanalysis Unit, which was that we couldn't have events anymore because no one could meet, and we'd never done online events before, and we needed to figure out how to do it. So this is our first go at it. We ask for your patience and tolerance as we explore how to do it. But we think that the very kind of concrete problem that we had, how do you bring people together online, also has a more kind of general relevance, which is the question of, how in these strange circumstances that we find ourselves in now, how do we create a different kind of community or experience of community? And this is, a problem for both the psychoanalytic community and the academic community, both of which have historically been defined by in-person interaction and are having to adapt very rapidly to a very different situation, at least in the short term. So rather than assuming that we know what we're doing, which clearly we don't, we wanted to take a collaborative approach. One of the things that's unique about us humans is our ability to collaborate to solve novel problems. Arguably, that's why we've been so successful as a species. And we think that the ideas that we've been developing in the Psychoanalysis Unit around the concept of epistemic trust might be helpful in getting us to think about both the existing problems that our communities are now being forced to face and the new problems that the situation of the pandemic has created. So a little bit about epistemic trust, just to frame the discussion. What is it and why is it important? This is the kind of presentation that Peter Fonagy would never give. I've really boiled it down, the digested reads digested. So, as I've said already, one of the things that's unique about us humans is our ability to adapt rapidly to an extremely wide range of cultures and environments. If you think about all the different circumstances in which babies are born all over the world and how they, have to adapt to very different contexts, then you quickly realize that in order for us to be able to thrive wherever we find ourselves, one of the things that we need is to be able to learn very quickly about our social and cultural context. We can't, an attitude of systematic doubt of everything that we're told in a new situation is not very adaptive. We do need to be able to take new stuff in, but we also, of course, need to be able to identify trustworthy sources of new knowledge. Dan Sperber has talked about the need for epistemic vigilance. You can't assume that everyone is trustworthy. So we say that a person's capacity for epistemic trust is the ability to trust appropriately in cultural sources of new knowledge. So it's about a balance. Blind trust is not adaptive because not everyone's trustworthy. But neither is an attitude of hypervigilance because some people are. So we need to be somewhere in the middle And that, you know, having the capacity for epistemic trust it involves being able to make good judgments about who to trust. And how do we figure out who we can trust? Well, developmental research suggests that infants are much more likely to trust individuals who, when they communicate with them, use what we call ostensive cues, another awkward and cumbersome term, which was introduced by George Gergely and Gergely Chibra in their work. What's an ostensive cue? Ostension is about showing someone something. So it's a kind of cue that you give to indicate to the person you're communicating with that you've got something important that they need to know. And what in their research Gergely and Chibra found was that what these kinds of cues have in common is that they are signals that we, the learner, the person in the learning position, is recognized as a person who has agency. So in the case of communicating with babies, one example or a couple of examples of ostensive cues are turn-taking reactivity. So the kind of back and forth interaction that you see between the caregiver and the baby, where, you know, the baby makes a sound or a noise or a gesture and the adult responds to it, creating a kind of proto-conversation. That would be one example. Eye contact, really looking at someone, widening your eyes, making them feel that they're seen as a person. And we think that being mentalized is another example of a kind of ostensive cue. So being mentalized is another way of recognizing the other as a person with agency. We've talked about the concept of mentalization a lot over the years. Just by way of a reminder what we mean when we talk about mentalizing. So mentalizing, as we've often said, is a form of mostly pre-conscious, imaginative mental activity that enables us to perceive and interpret human behavior in terms of intentional mental states, such as needs and desires and feelings. So it's about, you know, recognizing the other as an agent whose behavior is determined by what they're feeling and thinking. And I think it's really important that it's an imaginative activity. One of the key things to realize about mentalizing is that you can't ever really know what the other person's thinking. And that sounds so obvious that it's almost not worth stating, but of course we all fall into thinking all the time that we know what the other person is thinking. I know that you're thinking X in an argument, let's say, or you know, we feel more sure about it than is really appropriate. So mentalizing, the experience of having your mind being thought about by someone else, having your mind being held in mind, is an experience that predisposes you to be more likely to take in what that other person is telling you. If you feel that you're recognized and seen as a person, and the person communicating with you is sharing something with you, then it makes it much more likely that you'll take that in as something that is relevant to you. So ostensive cues, including the experience of being mentalized, dispose us to trust the communicator and take in what they're telling us as having personal relevance. And of course, if that's true, then our ability to mentalize is also helpful in helping us to know who to trust, because we have to have some sense of, of our own mind and of what we feel and think, to be able to recognize the other person's representation of us as an accurate representation. To feel understood, we need to have a little bit of understanding of ourselves also. So the ability to mentalize is really important in creating the possibility of epistemic trust, which is key for learning and adaptation. What makes it all a bit more complicated is that in times of great stress and emotional arousal, our capacity to mentalize becomes quite compromised and can even go completely offline. So, I'm sure everyone's had the experience of, let's say, having an argument with a loved one, and becoming upset and frustrated and really finding it very difficult to think about where they're coming from and what they're saying. If you're very worried about somebody else and fearful for them, then that can also make it quite difficult to think about both what's going on in your own mind and what's going on in the mind of the other. And so this is kind of the challenge that I think we face now. The pandemic that we're living through right now has left all of us in, at times, certainly at the beginning, and I'm sure it comes and goes for everyone now too, very fearful and very anxious, both for our loved ones and for ourselves. It's also both exposed and exacerbated fault lines that exist in our communities, and it has enforced radical changes to the way we live. So we've got a situation where there's a really acute need for rapid adaptation to address both the problems that have been exposed and the new problems created by the current situation. And this is coupled with a somewhat compromised adaptive capacity, because it is more difficult than it usually is, I think, to think right now, and particularly to think about what's happening in each other's minds, and that makes collaboration more challenging. So a few questions that I thought maybe we can just have in mind as we begin our discussion. How can we, both as individuals and collectively, respond to the need for change that the pandemic's both uncovered and created? That's one question. Another one, I think, is, one consequence of being in this situation is that there's a greatly increased need for vigilance. We're all having to be very careful about what we do, who we see, where we go. How do we balance that with the need to retain a capacity to trust others, hold them in mind, find ways of reaching out to them? And another question I think that could be interesting to think about is, what do leaders at the moment need to do to be able to restore our trust in them? Because I think trust in leadership is a really big issue at the moment. Chloe, I don't know if you have any initial thoughts about any of that.
The thing about this seminar that I find slightly horrifying but also interesting is that something that you and I, Liz, have been talking about for ages is sort of thinking about epistemic trust outside. Everything that we've previously written has been about pathology, it's been about treatment, it's been about thinking about epistemic trust in relation to mental health disorders. But I think, and we've always kind of tried to argue against that or kind of temper that point by saying disruptions in epistemic trust are adaptive. We all get disruptions in epistemic trust, and sometimes, you know, this isn't just it's you know, it's not a new point that disruptions are adaptive rather than necessarily disorder. But we've tried to emphasize that, but we've never quite played it out fully. And now I feel like with everything that's happening at the moment, with the pandemic, but also with everything that's going on with Black Lives Matter, everything seems to reinforce this idea that actually we all are constantly monitoring epistemic trust, and we all, and some of us in different communities who have different experiences of epistemic trust, there's no one kind of correct level of epistemic trust, and we all vary hugely at different moments. And I was just wondering what for you feel that the current environment, how that might have changed your perspectives on epistemic trust, both through your own personal experience and also more theoretically.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot since the whole current situation started. So I would say that when I think, for example, about, you know, the issue of what we call hypervigilance, and that's often a kind of marker of, we tend to think of that as a marker of psychopathology. We have tended to think of it in that way. But, you know, when we found ourselves in this situation with this virus spreading uncontrollably and having to all retreat into our homes and be isolated from one another, and the kind of stress and anxiety that caused, and, you know, the fear for loved ones. You know, I was worried about my father, who's, you know, in the age range that needs to be worried, and I'm sure that everyone's had those kinds of experiences. It just really sort of brought home to me what it feels like to be in a state of hypervigilance, because I was in it. And, you know, kind of feeling like I don't know what the right thing to do is. I don't know whether what I'm being told is the right advice. You know, how can I feel any confidence in any of the guidance? No one seems to know what to do. Yeah, so it really made me appreciate in a new way. And it's not that theoretically I didn't appreciate this before, but the things that we talk about often as kind of, you know, characteristic of certain kinds of psychopathology are in all of us. The capacity for that is in all of us, and changes in the environment play a really big role in bringing that out.
And rightly, no, because I mean, otherwise, you know, the fact that our epistemic trust has been challenged in the current situation, I think it's appropriate. And it's actually, if we didn't have that capacity for vigilance and to challenge things that are being, you know, things that don't seem trustworthy for us, we wouldn't really have the capacity to critique poor governance or really to formulate protest, and all those things that we're seeing now are so important to hold people to account. So it's almost like, not only is it adaptive, it's just actually essential to be able to kind of be so, for us to be vigilant towards the kind of signs of us not being mentalized. And I'd say, slightly political example, but Dominic Cummings' account of how he came to, you know, transgress the lockdown rules, I think particularly with his account about going to the castle, it was very unmentalizing, because he was assuming that we would kind of go, oh yeah, that makes sense, and he just had no sense of how people would think about that explanation. It was a kind of completely non-mentalizing attempt at an excuse, and of course for us it felt like a massive kind of negative ostensive cue. And that's right and natural. So I kind of think it's sort of, as you say, it's kind of not only taking us beyond thinking about psychopathology, but also seeing it as an essential part of human kind of cultural functioning.